Station 6. Who authorized this?
The consommé burned. I covered the gap.
You brought your personal food into my kitchen and served it to my guests.
It worked. Worked. A dishwasher thinks soup scraps is fine dining.
Chef, table 9 has already...
Pull every bowl, right now. That soup is the reason my daughter started eating again. Not my problem, Station 6.
Graham Voss had built Maison Orsay's reputation on one certainty: he knew exactly what belonged in his kitchen and who did not. When he poured that pot down the drain, he was not rejecting a dish. He was issuing a verdict that a dishwasher's cooking was invisible by definition, that talent without a title did not count. What he did not know was that a Michelin inspector had already tasted that soup at Table 9, and that the man at Station 6 was not who he assumed. What happens when the person you dismiss turns out to be the most dangerous man in the room? If you've ever watched someone's work get dismissed before it was even tasted, stay with this story, because what happens next is worth every minute. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. Stories like this one come out every week. Darnell Pierce had learned to keep 2 lives running at the same time, without either one knowing how close the other was to falling apart. During the day, he was a father up before the sun making breakfast, while Leah gathered her things, driving her to school, in a car with a heater that only worked on the passenger side. At night, he stood in the back corner of Maison Orsay's kitchen, a 2 Michelin-star French restaurant in Manhattan, where his job title was dishwasher, and his name, as far as the executive chef was concerned, was Station 6. 3 years earlier, his wife Mara had died of cancer. The illness took nearly 2 years, and in that time, Darnell had spent everything he had borrowed more than he could comfortably repay, and left culinary school with less than 1 semester remaining. He had been among the top students at the Culinary Institute of America. His instructors had said he had a rare instinct for layered flavor, the kind that came not from following recipes, but from understanding what a dish was trying to say. None of that was useful during Mara's final months. The only thing that mattered then was being present. After the funeral, Leah stopped eating. It was not dramatic. She would sit at the table, push food around her plate, take half a bite, go quiet. Darnell tried everything he could think of. He bought the foods she had always loved. He let her choose anything she wanted from the grocery store. He made elaborate meals and simple ones and said nothing either way. What he could not fix was where her eyes went every time she sat down straight to the empty chair across from her, the one that no longer had anyone in it. What finally worked was a soup he found in a brown leather notebook that had belonged to his grandmother, Bernice. She had run a small lunch counter in Beaufort, South Carolina, starting in the early 1960s, and the notebook was where she kept everything she had learned about feeding people. The recipe was built on a slow-braised oxtail base with smoked turkey neck, blue crab shells, okra, and the spice combinations that came out of the Gullah Geechee cooking tradition of the Carolina Low Country. Darnell added 1 layer of his own. He clarified the broth, using a classical French technique he had learned at school, drawing the fat and impurities out with egg whites and crushed tomato until the liquid ran clear and deep as amber. He adjusted the formula 5 times before Leah finished a full bowl. That night, she asked if there was more. He wrote the final version on one of the blank pages Bernice had left at the back of the notebook, beneath a line in her handwriting that read, "A recipe only truly lives when the next generation is brave enough to add their own story to it." He titled the new page Golden Soup Version 5, for Leah. After that, the notebook stayed in his locker at Maison Orsay, and every night before his shift, he touched the spine of it. It was the only promise he made out loud to no one in particular, that this job was temporary, that eventually there would be a stove of his own. Graham Voss had built his entire identity around the idea that kitchens had a natural order, and that the order was visible from 20 feet away. On television, he was composed and philosophical, the kind of chef who spoke about cuisine the way academics speak about literature. In his own kitchen, he assigned numbers to the dishwashers and used those numbers exclusively. He had never once asked Darnell for his name. When he learned that Darnell was raising a child alone, he treated it as a professional liability rather than a personal circumstance, rescheduling shifts without notice, mocking the packed lunches in the break room, refrigerator announcing to the kitchen one evening that a man washing dishes to pay for his daughter's school supplies had no standing to form opinions about food. He once caught sight of the leather notebook in Darnell's open locker and kept walking, saying without stopping that home cooking did not belong in a Michelin kitchen. Darnell said nothing. He needed the job and the health insurance and the money, and he knew that responding to Graham Voss in any form would cost him all three. What Graham could not see because he was not looking was that two people in that kitchen had already understood exactly who Darnell was. Owen Mercer, the sous chef, had broken a beurre blanc during a Friday rush 6 months earlier and was trying to rescue it when Darnell rolled a cart past and set a single ice cube on the edge of his station without a word or a glance. Owen used it to bring the emulsion back together. He stood in the walk-in cooler afterward for nearly a minute, thinking about what that meant. You do not know to do that unless someone trained you. You do not do it quietly unless it has become instinct. Leon Baptiste had managed the dining room at Maison Orsay for 11 years and had worked beside enough serious cooks to recognize what he was seeing. He watched the way Darnell held his palm near a pot without touching it, to read the heat, the way he could identify an off-ratio sauce from across the room by smell alone. One night, Leon asked him directly whether he had stood in front of a professional stove before. Darnell said before he had to stand next to a hospital bed. Leon did not ask again. The answer was complete. Hannah Reyes had been at Maison Orsay for only 6 weeks when she nearly dropped a full tray of plated entrees during a Saturday service. Darnell caught the tray from underneath, without breaking stride, steadied it, and kept moving. When she found him afterward and asked why he had not said anything to anyone, he told her that in this kitchen every mistake got written on the record of whoever stood lowest in the room, not whoever caused it. She thought about that sentence for a long time after. The night everything changed was also the night Graham was filming for a new television series. A production crew occupied part of the dining room, and a guest had reserved under the name El Moreau, a name the senior staff had discussed quietly because it might belong to the Michelin inspector, whose visit could decide whether the restaurant earned a 3rd star. The kitchen that evening was running on something tighter than discipline. 45 minutes before service, Owen burned the consommé, not slightly, completely. A fresh batch needed a minimum of 90 minutes, and the restaurant had 50. Owen brought the information to Graham and watched the chef's face settle into refusal. Graham would not change the menu, would not acknowledge the problem in front of the cameras, and told Owen to handle it before walking back toward the interview setup. Darnell had heard the exchange from the corridor near the dish station. He had arrived early that morning before anyone else and had been running a small pot of golden soup on the back burner since 6 in the morning, planning to bring it home for Leah's birthday after his shift. He stood in the corridor and did the math. He called Leah from the back stairwell. She picked up quickly, and he explained that he might be running late, that something had come up at work. She had heard that before. She asked in the flat, honest tone that 10-year-olds produce without effort whether he was saving their restaurant again. He did not know what to say to that. Then she said something that she had no way of knowing would change the direction of the entire evening, that her mom would say not to keep his food hiding in a box. He ended the call, went to the back burner, put on his apron, and finished 9 portions of golden soup. Leon served them, as though they had always been on the menu. At table 9, Laurent Moreau received his bowl, lifted a spoonful, set it down and lifted another. He opened a small notebook and wrote something in it. Across the room, a former classmate of Darnell's from the Culinary Institute, now working as a food journalist, recognized the presentation and the flavor logic behind it, and leaned toward the person beside him to say just above a whisper that the dish had been made by someone he had gone to school with, someone he had not seen in years. Graham found out between courses. He came through the kitchen doors, quickly located Darnell at the back station, and demanded to know who had authorized the substitution. Darnell explained the consommé was gone, a gap needed to be covered, and he had covered it. Graham pulled the lid from the pot, still warming on the burner, and looked at the okra and smelled the spice base. He set the lid back down. He did not taste a single spoonful. What happened next was something that would be repeated and referenced for months afterward. Graham told the kitchen loudly, with Owen and Hannah and every prep cook and runner in earshot, that what Darnell had done was bring poverty food into a professional kitchen and serve it to guests who were paying for precision. He said the word trash more than once. He delivered every word with the certainty of a man who has never needed to question his own judgment. Darnell kept his voice level and said that the soup had been the first thing his daughter agreed to eat after her mother died. Graham's response required no deliberation. He was running a restaurant, not a grief support service. Then he tilted the pot and emptied it into the drain. Laurent Moreau walked through the kitchen doors at almost exactly that moment. He walked past Graham entirely and looked at Darnell, directly asking whether the dish served to the dining room had come from his station. Darnell said yes. Laurent wrote down his full name and set a business card on the counter beside the empty pot. Before he left, he turned briefly toward Graham and said that some kitchens possessed technique and some kitchens possessed a soul. And tonight he had found only one of the two. The kitchen went still in a way that had nothing to do with noise. Graham understood the implication immediately, and 2 weeks later, a container of white truffle went missing from the storeroom. Graham told the kitchen manager he had found evidence pointing to Darnell's locker. Darnell was brought in and presented with a separation agreement, a final paycheck, a neutral reference letter, and a non-disclosure clause in exchange for his signature. He had rent coming due. He had Leah's school tuition. He had nothing certain waiting on the other side. I did not sign. He took his knife, roll, his apron, and the brown leather notebook from his locker and walked out of Maison Orsay without speaking to anyone. That night, Leah found him sitting in their dark kitchen and asked whether they had poured out his soup. He nodded. She left the room and came back with a sheet of paper, a drawing she had made of a man standing inside a restaurant with a large star above his head. At the bottom, in careful block letters, she had written, "They poured out the soup, but they can't pour out you." Darnell looked at the drawing for a while. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and found the business card Laurent Moreau had left on the counter next to the empty pot. He dialed the number. When Laurent answered and asked where they should meet, Darnell said somewhere his daughter could watch him cook. Laurent Moreau could not invest directly. The independent standards that governed Michelin's inspection process made that impossible, and he said so plainly when they met. What he could do was make a phone call. The woman he called was Colette Renard, a former hotel owner from Lyon, who had spent 30 years in the hospitality industry and was now looking by her own description for one final project worth her attention. She agreed to meet Darnell at a coffee shop in Midtown on a Tuesday morning, and she arrived 7 minutes early. She did not ask about his social media presence or whether he had television experience. She did not ask for a business plan or a projected return timeline. The first question she asked was what he had cooked for his daughter during the worst period of her life. Darnell told her about the soup, about the 5 versions, about Bernice's notebook, about the night Leah finally finished a full bowl and asked for more. Colette listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him she was going to give him $460,000, and she had 3 conditions. He retained full creative authority over the menu. The family story was never to be used as a marketing device, and Leah was to have a dedicated table in the dining room where she could do her homework every evening. The restaurant was open. Darnell found a 26-seat space in Harlem that had previously been a tailor's shop. The ceilings were low and the kitchen was narrow, and the ventilation system needed complete replacement. But the light that came through the front windows in the late afternoon fell across the room in a way that made everything inside it look like it had been there for decades. He named the restaurant Bernice's Table. The menu was built around Gullah Geechee cooking, refracted through classical French technique, she crab bisque, finished with a sherry reduction, Hoppin' John made with heirloom field peas, and a smoked ham hock stock, brown butter roasted chicken Benny wafers served warm alongside sweet potato cake with a cane syrup glaze, and golden soup which appeared at the top of the menu without elaboration. Leon Baptiste resigned from Maison Orsay the week before Bernice's Table opened. He told Darnell he was not interested in being the dining room manager. He wanted to be listed on the menu as co-founder of the front of house, because that was what he would actually be. Darnell agreed without hesitation. Owen Mercer did not come immediately. He was still under contract and cautious about what leaving would cost him. But a week before opening, he sent Darnell a photograph of a handwritten internal log entries in Graham's own notation that documented a series of inventory discrepancies Graham had personally attributed to Darnell's station without any supporting evidence. Owen sent no message with the photograph. The image alone said everything it needed to say, and Darnell kept it. The first 3 weeks were quiet, in the way that required a different kind of courage than the chaos Darnell had been bracing for. Tables filled slowly. Critics had not yet arrived. Word was spreading by mouth rather than by press, and the restaurant operated close enough to the margin that Darnell tracked every supply order himself and cross-referenced it against the evening's receipts before he went to sleep. Leah did her homework at the corner table by the window every night, and whenever Darnell sent out a new test version of a dish, she was the first to taste it. She had developed a vocabulary for this without being taught one. She would say things like, "The broth feels tired," or "This one knows what it wants." Darnell wrote her notes in the margins of the notebook. Then Graham moved, 6 weeks after Bernice's Table opened its doors. Darnell received a formal letter from a law firm representing Graham Voss and Maison Orsay. The letter argued that golden soup had been developed during Darnell's period of employment, using time and mental resources for which the restaurant had compensated him, and that the intellectual property therefore belonged to the establishment. The demand was simple: cease serving the dish immediately or face litigation. Darnell sat with the letter at the counter in his kitchen for a long time after Leah had gone to bed. His attorney, Tessa Morgan, was direct with him at their first meeting. Graham's legal team had significant resources behind them. There was a production company and a media group involved, which meant the litigation budget was not coming from a single restaurant's operating funds. If the case dragged on, the legal costs alone could bankrupt Bernice's Table before any verdict was reached. She gave Darnell 3 weeks to find documentation and told him that without it, she would have to advise him to settle. He considered pulling the soup from the menu. The calculation was not abstract: Colette's investment, the lease, Leon's salary, Leah's stability. Everything he had rebuilt in 6 weeks was sitting on the other side of a decision that felt in the middle of the night, entirely reasonable. Then Leah came into the kitchen for a glass of water and found him at the counter with the letter. She read enough of it to understand the shape of it. She asked him whether he was thinking about taking the soup off the menu because the man was threatening him. When Darnell did not answer quickly enough, she said, if he gave it up because someone frightened him into it. What was she supposed to do when someone tried to frighten her into giving up something that was hers? He did not sleep that night. In the morning, he brought Tessa the notebook. What Tessa found inside it restructured the entire legal argument. The base recipe, oxtail smoked turkey, neck blue, crab shells, okra, the gullah geechee spice ratios, was recorded in Bernice's handwriting and dated to the early 1960s. The French clarification technique appeared in Bernice's own notes as something she had learned from a French cook who had worked briefly in Charleston, which she had then folded into her family cooking, long before culinary schools were teaching it in a formal curriculum. Darnell's additions carried dates that preceded his employment at Maison Orsay. The final version, the one titled For Leah, was dated to the weeks immediately following Mara's funeral, at a time when Graham Voss had not yet learned that Darnell could cook. A forensic document examiner assessed the paper, the ink composition, and the leather of the binding. Photographs from Bernice's family, some of them showing the lunch counter in Beaufort, with handwritten menu boards visible in the background, confirmed that a version of the soup had been served publicly for decades before Maison Orsay existed. Graham's legal team withdrew the claim within 10 days of receiving Tessa's documentation package. In the days that followed, Darnell understood something about the notebook that he had not fully articulated before. It had always been a record of a family's cooking. But it had also functioned without anyone planning it that way, as evidence proof that people whose contributions had never been formally credited had in fact been working, innovating, and building something worth protecting. The notebook had saved the soup, which meant Bernice, who had been gone for years, had protected her grandson from a man who had never once considered her worth knowing. Exactly 6 months after Graham tilted the pot and emptied it into the drain, the Michelin announcement was made. Bernice's table received 1 star. Darnell Pierce was listed as the chef. He took Leah to the ceremony. She was wearing the same dress she had worn to her last school recital, and she had braided her own hair and was not entirely satisfied with the result, but had decided it was acceptable. When the announcer said the restaurant's name and then said his name, Leah stood up before anyone else in the room. Darnell walked to the stage with Bernice's notebook under his arm. He spoke for less than 2 minutes. He said the soup had not been made to win anything. It had been made so that a child who was missing her mother would agree to eat 1 more spoonful. He said that 6 months earlier someone had called it trash and poured it into a drain, and that tonight the restaurant built around that soup was being recognized by the same institution that had given that man his reputation. He did not say Graham's name. He did not need to. The story moved fast after that. By the following morning, it had traveled far beyond the food press. Reservations at Bernice's table filled out to 14 weeks. Colette called to say she had not expected this timeline and had no complaints. Darnell kept the restaurant at 26 seats and declined every offer to expand. Graham Voss watched all of this from a position that was deteriorating faster than he had anticipated. His television series had been suspended after the network received preliminary information about the inventory incident, and the industry press that had once treated him as a defining figure in New York's fine dining scene was beginning to ask questions he had not prepared answers for. Graham chose under these circumstances to go on offense. He gave 2 recorded interviews in which he argued that the Michelin recognition had less to do with the food and more to do with a narrative that the committee had found emotionally compelling: a single father, a dead wife, a bowl of soup. He said that sentiment was not a culinary standard, and that if golden soup were tasted without the story attached to it, it would not distinguish itself from what was being served in thousands of home kitchens. A television producer named Grant Keeler took Graham up on it almost immediately. The format he proposed was straightforward. Darnell and Graham would each prepare golden soup in a live kitchen, working simultaneously, with the results judged by 3 tasters who would not know which bowl belonged to whom. No personal narrative would be permitted to enter the scoring. The winner would receive a development fund of $250,000. Darnell's first response was that he had nothing to prove and nowhere left to go that required using Graham Voss as a stepping stone. He had the restaurant, the star, and his daughter doing her homework at the corner table. Then Leah came home from school one afternoon and went directly to her room without stopping in the kitchen the way she usually did. It took Darnell an hour to get the full story. Some of her classmates, having seen one of Graham's interviews shared by their parents, had told her that her father's star was a sympathy award, that the judges had felt sorry for a man with a sad story. One of them had used the word charity in a way that was designed to land, and it had. Darnell called Grant Keeler the next morning and confirmed his participation. He told Leah that evening that he was doing it not to punish Graham, but because he wanted her to know in a way that could not be argued away or reframed that what he could do in a kitchen existed completely independently of anyone knowing his name or his circumstances. Graham's preparation for the competition was methodical. He brought in a culinary historian who specialized in Southern American food traditions, acquired academic texts on Gullah Geechee cooking, and reverse-engineered the dish from what he had smelled and briefly observed the night he poured it out. He treated golden soup as a problem to be solved, a formula that could be disassembled and reconstructed by someone with sufficient technical knowledge. Darnell spent the week before the competition reading through the notebook with Leah. On one of the older pages, in Bernice's careful script, he found a line he had not noticed before. The pot remembers whose hands stirred it. Don't cook the ingredients. Cook for whoever is waiting at the table. On the day before the competition, he pressed seeds from Bernice's old bene crop through a hand-ground stone mortar to extract the oil. A process that took most of the afternoon and produced something no commercial supplier carried. He had never disclosed this detail publicly. It was the kind of knowledge that lived only in the doing of it, passed down not through instruction, but through watching someone's hands work until the motion became your own. The morning of the competition, Hannah Reyes arrived at the television studio early. She had been assigned to handle logistics for the event, coordinating ingredient delivery, managing the prep station timeline, ensuring both competitors received what they needed on schedule. She knew the layout better than anyone else in the building by the time the cameras were in position, and she carried her phone in her apron pocket because that was where she always kept it. The competition was staged in a television studio in Midtown that had been configured to look like a professional kitchen. 2 identical stations, identical equipment, identical ingredient sets laid out in identical order. The producers had been careful about symmetry. What they had not accounted for was Hannah Reyes arriving before anyone else and learning every detail of the layout before the cameras were switched on. The first hour of the competition ran without incident. Both men worked without speaking, without looking at each other's stations, in the focused and slightly performative silence that live cooking generates when cameras are present. Graham moved with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed every step. He had clearly practiced the dish multiple times and had developed a sequence that minimized variables. Darnell worked differently, not slower, but with a different kind of attention. The kind that comes from having made the same thing so many times that the process has stopped being a sequence and become something closer to a conversation. Partway through the first hour, Hannah's phone received a message. She looked at the screen, read it twice, and did not move for a moment. The message was from Graham. It asked her to hold Darnell's blue crab shells at the supply station under the pretense of a quality check long enough to compress his timing on the clarification step. Hannah stood with the phone in her hand and thought about what Darnell had told her the night she almost dropped the tray at Maison Orsay. That in that kitchen, mistakes were recorded against whoever stood lowest. She walked directly onto the set, located the nearest camera operator, and held up her phone screen. The footage aired within seconds on the studio's live feed. Graham was given a formal warning by the event producers, but was not disqualified because no physical interference with Darnell's ingredients had taken place. Graham said nothing in response to the warning. He returned to his station and continued working with the expression of someone who has decided that the only path forward is to finish what he started. The second hour was where the competition became something other than a cooking contest. Graham's raft, the protein and acid matrix used to draw impurities from a clarified broth, broke apart in the pot. The broth clouded. It was not catastrophic. The flavor foundation was intact, and a skilled cook could finish the dish in a way that remained technically respectable. Graham adjusted and kept moving, though the result would not be what he had intended. At Darnell's station, a different problem had developed. One of the induction units under his primary pot was running hotter than calibrated, and the broth had been reducing at a rate faster than his timeline assumed. He caught it before it went too far, but the window for correction was narrow. If he continued, reducing the salt concentration would cross the line. If he added liquid to compensate the layered depth of the stock, the hours of slow extraction that gave the soup its particular quality would thin out in a way that no finishing technique could fully recover. He looked up. Through the glass partition at the far end of the studio, in the area where guests had been seated to observe, he could see Leah. She was holding the drawing she had made for him, the one with the star above the restaurant, the one she had brought to him the night he sat in their dark kitchen after leaving Maison Orsay. She was not waving. She was just holding it, watching him. Darnell thought about the first time he had made the soup. Not version 5, not the refined iteration. He had been serving at Bernice's table for months, the first version made in their apartment kitchen, with a cheap stock pot, and whatever he had been able to find that matched Bernice's ingredient list closely enough to try. He had no proper strainer, no kitchen scale, no thermometer. He had Bernice's notebook open on the counter, and a daughter who had not finished a full meal in 11 days. He had worked by feel and by memory, and by something that was not technique, but was not separate from it either. He pulled a small ramekin from the supply shelf beside his station. He ladled a portion of the reduced broth into it, let it settle, and assessed it the way Bernice's notes described assessing any dish that had been pushed past its intended range, not against what it was supposed to be, but against what it still had left. He made 2 adjustments using methods drawn from the same section of the notebook that described what his grandmother had done when the kitchen ran short and the guests were already at the table. The broth came back not to where it had been before the error, but to something that was honest about what had happened and had decided to be itself anyway. Both dishes were completed within the final 10 minutes. The producers transferred them to identical ceramic bowls, placed them behind a partition, and marked them Bowl A and Bowl B. The 3 judges received their bowls in a separate room without Graham or Darnell present. The judging panel had been selected by the production team for their independence from both competitors. Laurent Moreau, who had retired from active Michelin inspection earlier that year and was now consulting independently, had accepted a seat at the table in a private capacity. He had made clear to the producers that he had no current institutional affiliation that could compromise the result, and the other 2 judges had confirmed they had no objection to his presence. The first judge worked her way through both portions before speaking. She noted that Bowl A demonstrated controlled technique and a clean flavor profile that showed the cook understood the dish's structure. The balance was precise. The presentation was composed. It tasted, she said, like something that had been studied very seriously. Bowl B was different in a way she found harder to articulate. The depth did not announce itself, it accumulated. She said it reminded her of food made by someone who was not cooking to demonstrate anything. The second judge went to Bowl B first and stayed there longer than the format required. When he spoke, he said that Bowl A was technically accomplished and would satisfy any reasonable standard of quality. Then he said that Bowl B did something that technique alone could not produce. It made him think of a person rather than a place. Not the person who cooked it, but someone who had once cooked for him. Laurent Moreau tasted both bowls with the same unhurried attention he had brought to Table 9 at Maison Orsay 6 months earlier. When he set down his spoon, he said that Bowl A was an excellent reconstruction. It showed what a rigorous and talented cook could achieve when given a clear target and sufficient preparation time. Bowl B was not a reconstruction. It was a continuation. The difference, he said, was the difference between an instrument playing a piece of music and an instrument that had been played for so long it had begun to sound like the musician. Bowl B received all 3 votes. The cards were brought out and placed face down on the judging table, then turned over simultaneously. Bowl A. Graham Voss, Bowl B. Darnell Pierce. The studio audience had been quiet through the judging. When the cards were turned, the room did not erupt immediately. There was a moment where people seemed to be confirming what they were seeing before they allowed themselves to react. Then Laurent spoke again, clearly enough for the microphones to carry it. He had been present at Maison Orsay the night the dish was first served, and he had waited 6 months to taste it again. He said that Bowl B had not won because its cook was a single father with a painful history. It had won because it was the better dish. The audience stood. Leah, visible through the glass partition, had both hands pressed flat against it. She was crying without making any effort to conceal it, and she did not look away from her father. A producer brought a microphone to Graham and asked whether he wished to contest the result. Graham looked at the score, at Laurent's written notes, at the 3 unanimous votes. He said 4 words: the dish was better. It was the first time in Leah's life that she had heard the man who had called her father a failure say out loud, in front of everyone, that her father was right. Darnell received the $250,000 development fund and announced within the week what he intended to do with it. He established a foundation in Mara's name, the Mara Pierce Culinary Fund, designed to support single parents who had left culinary training to care for a child or a sick spouse and who needed structured help to return. The fund covered tuition, provided subsidized childcare during class, and kitchen hours, offered paid externship placements, and included financial counseling for families still carrying medical debt. At the press conference, Darnell said that talent does not disappear when someone becomes a parent. Sometimes it simply has to wait in the hallway, outside a hospital room, or beside a crib, or behind a dish station, until there is space for it to come back in. In the months that followed, Hannah submitted her full message exchange with Graham to the network's standards review. Owen, now free from his contract, came forward publicly with the internal logs. He had photographed his own documented account of Graham directing the kitchen manager to attribute the missing truffle inventory to Darnell's station without evidence. Other former employees added their accounts. The full picture that emerged was enough to end Graham's television career permanently and trigger a Michelin re-evaluation of Maison Orsay. The restaurant lost its second-star reservations, collapsed, and it closed before the end of the year. Owen Mercer called Darnell the week Maison Orsay closed and asked whether there was a place for him at Bernice's table. Darnell told him yes, starting at the lowest position in the kitchen, learning the prep work and the dish station, and the rhythms of a room where everyone had a name, including the people who washed the plates. Owen agreed to those terms without negotiating. He started the following Monday. Leon was already listed on the menu as co-founder of the front of house. Colette used a portion of her own capital to establish a preservation archive for family recipes from communities whose culinary contributions had entered the broader American food tradition without credit or documentation. Bernice's notebook was eventually placed on permanent display at a cultural research center in Harlem. The case beside it held a printed card that read, "A recorded recipe can feed a family. A protected recipe can save a generation." 1 year after the competition, Bernice's table was closed for the evening. The last guests had left, Leon had locked the front door, and the kitchen had been cleaned and set for the following day. Darnell came out of the kitchen and found what he had come to think of as the best part of the day. Leah asleep at the corner table by the window, head resting on her open homework notebook, a bowl of golden soup beside her with only 1 spoonful left in it. He took his jacket from the hook near the door and draped it over her shoulders without waking her. He stood for a moment in front of the 2 photographs on the wall, Bernice outside the lunch counter and Beaufort Mara in the kitchen of their first apartment. And then he sat down at the corner table, opened Bernice's notebook to the page titled Golden Soup Version 5. For Leah, and wrote beneath it, 1 year later, "She still leaves the last spoonful for me." Leah stirred and looked up at him. She asked in the half-aware way of someone not fully returned from sleep whether he still felt sad about what Graham had called the soup. Darnell looked around the room at the kitchen behind the pass, at the Michelin star, mounted on the wall, at the notebook, open in front of him, at the girl across the table who had once pushed food around a plate in a silent apartment and was now leaving him the last spoonful as a matter of habit. He told her no. He said Graham had only seen a pot of soup. Darnell had always known what it actually was. He closed the notebook and turned off the dining room lights. Outside, the sign above the door read the same thing it had read since the day Bernice's table opened. "Everyone who walks into this kitchen has a name." What Darnell built was never just a restaurant. It was proof that talent does not expire when life gets hard, that the years spent at a bedside or behind a dish station or making sure a child eats are not lost years. They are the years that make the food mean something. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribing takes 1 second. It's the easiest way to make sure the next story finds you.